Hey, what's up, Internet? I can't tell you how excited I am to already have 10 subscribers and over 40 views on my first video about RBC. I really appreciate all of you who are watching. In this video, let's talk about the Canadian National Railway, aka CN. They're not only Canada's largest railway in terms of revenue, but also the largest in terms of the size of the railway system itself. It spans from the East Coast in the Maritimes all the way to the West Coast in BC, into the US all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Their track is an absolutely mind-boggling 33,000 kilometers long. I can guarantee that if you've ever lived in Canada, you've seen this train choo-choo down the rail with its classic CN cargo containers. But it wasn't always like this for the transportation giant. They've had one of the most interesting histories a Canadian company could have. Before we chat about their fall and rise, let's first talk about how they came to be because it's a fascinating story that shows resilience throughout its history. I'm positive you will enjoy it as much as me. Before we dive into CN, we need to talk about some of its predecessors. So, this story began just as industrialization in Canada was starting. In 1832, the Champlain and St. Lawrence Railroad was incorporated, and by 1837, it would begin operating within Quebec. In 1852, the first major Canadian railroad was born, Grand Trunk Railway. It was built originally to link Montreal to Toronto, and they were a very ambitious company. Over the next decades of the 19th and 20th centuries, many companies would open their own railways. Some of the important ones include Great Western, Intercolonial, Harbour Grace, Atlantic, BC Rail, Elgin Joliet, and Eastern Railways. Some of these networks were already owned by the Canadian government, but others would be absorbed by it or be acquired by Grand Trunk or other private competitors. All these separate systems, no matter how small or how big, would be spread across Canada and the US. In 1896, Donald Mann and William Mackenzie, the grandfather of our 10th Prime Minister William Mackenzie Lyon King, would start building the Canadian Northern Railway. They were very ambitious trailblazers who would acquire a few small lines from Manitoba, and by 1915 they would complete their transcontinental line from Vancouver to Montreal. Canadian Northern's logo would actually inspire CN's during the first few years of their existence. CN would essentially just replace Northern for National. In 1903, Grand Trunk would form a subsidiary, Grand Trunk Pacific. They were building a coast-to-coast line, breaking Canadian Pacific's monopoly in Western Canada and connecting Prince Rupert, BC to Winnipeg, Manitoba. Their mission was supported by the Canadian government through the National Transcontinental Act. That same year, the Canadian government would announce its plan to build the eastern part of the rail under the name National Transcontinental Railway. There was an incredible amount of labor needed to build the rail. Over 17,000 Asian workers were needed in the western section that Grand Trunk Pacific was building, and tens of thousands of Europeans, American, and Canadian workers building the eastern section of it. In 1919, Parliament would incorporate Canadian National Railway. This would include the independent railways that were already owned by the Canadian government. They would consist of Intercolonial, National Transcontinental, Prince Edward Island, Hudson Bay, and Canadian Northern Railways. Thus, CN was born, and now, over a century later, they're still chugging along like nobody's business. Sir Henry Thornton would be named the first president of the Crown Company in 1922, and would go on to lead the organization until 1932. He was one of the most polarizing figures who was both a visionary who not only expanded CN's network, but also improved their efficiency and introduced innovations in the industry. But, like most leaders, he was also criticized for overspending and mismanaging the company. He was eventually forced to resign during the financial crisis when a public inquiry investigated the company's affairs. This was in fact a contributor that led to CN's fall, as they would struggle financially, which was also compounded by the difficulties of many of the companies they merged with and acquired, who also had a lot of debt that Canada's government had to support. Due to World War I, many companies would have low capital, face increasing costs, and would witness decreasing revenues. To stay afloat, they had to continue to borrow while at the brink of bankruptcy. For example, our ambitious friend Grand Trunk would be acquired by CN for this very reason in 1923, and by 1927, Central Vermont Railway would also be taken over. Under Torton, the company pioneered radio programs in 1923 and would provide passengers with en route entertainment through their CNR radio brand, which would broadcast shows like Transcontinental Symphonies and General Motors hockey broadcast, which is now actually commonly known as Hockey Night in Canada. The passengers didn't have to stare blankly out the window for hours on end. I mean, who needs TikTok when you have the original Hockey Night in Canada? You may have guessed it. Due to political and competitive pressures, in 1932, they had to transfer their assets to another government-owned agency, CRBC, which would eventually become CBC. They also introduced the first diesel-electric passenger locomotive in 1929, diversified into hotel resorts, and pioneered two-way train phone service, which increased their efficiencies. Robert C. Vaughan would then take over as president from 1941 to 1950. Under him, CN would continue to add efficiencies. For example, they would install centralized traffic control in their maritime operations. And I know what you're thinking. This sounds like a complicated system, but don't worry. It's just a fancy way of saying that they had dispatch offices for controlling the rail system. They would continue to innovate by introducing diesel-electric locomotives into freight service between Montreal and Toronto and expand their system by acquiring Newfoundland Railway in 1949. Donald Gordon would then take the wheel as president from 1950 to 1956, and boy did he ever have his work cut out for him. Through his dynamic leadership, he would transform CN from a struggling company to a profitable and modern organization. This was really needed by the company, who was exhausted by the high competitive and operational demands of World War II, especially if they wanted to compete against the rising car and truck competition. During the war, they had to deal with labor issues, wear and tear of their infrastructure, the transportations of troops, equipment supplies, and materials across Canada to the ports for overseas shipment. Gordon would restructure their operations by replacing steam with diesel-powered engines, restoring the freight fleet, which had become worn out, and recruiting and training a very skilled management team. He would also reduce their debt and invest in new technologies like leasing United Aircraft turbo trains to service the Montreal to Toronto run, and introduce the Rapido passenger train, an express train on the same route. It was designed to compete with the automobile and airplane competition by offering fast, frequent, and comfortable service. With Gordon, they would also get into containerization and adopt computerization. They would continue to add efficiencies by extending centralized traffic control from coast to coast. The company would also introduce their new logo that's still used to this day. The logo is intended to promote an innovative, progressive, and dynamic organization. The new logo was evocative, and by removing the R, it was both bilingual and versatile, in that it could be used as a unifying symbol to tie its non-rail businesses together, such as hotels, telecommunication, and ferry services, to name a few. The new logo was a hit amongst employees and the public. The logo was actually changed after a 1959 survey found out that the public picture of the company as old-fashioned, backward, and hostile to innovation. This was of course the opposite of their goals. After Gordon's presidency, the company would continue to face struggles for a few decades. In 1976, CN would introduce the Via division, but by 1978, it would become its own crown corporation, Via Rail, so the latter could focus on passenger transportation and compete with cars. The following year, they would have to merge their telegraph services with their biggest competition, Canadian Pacific Railway. I know we haven't talked much about CP, but I didn't want to make this video too long because CP also has a long and interesting history that would be better presented in its own video. That said, they would form CNCP Telecommunications, but by 1988, they would sell all their shares from that service, and by 1990, Rogers would own it in entirety. These were tough years for CN, who also had to sell their hotels in 1988. CN would gather enormous debt and record losses in the 80s due to high interest rates, inflation, a recession, and labor disputes. In 1992, they would report a net loss of $1.1 billion because of limiting costs and lower revenues from their services. But after these turbulent and trying years, the company would actually rise up and really focus on its core operations, which is the main overarching reason for their success. Paul Tellier would become the president and CEO of CN from 1992 to 2002. He would rarely make the company bounce back while keeping them on track. He was a strategic leader and led CN's successful privatization and rebound them towards the top. Privatization was the first reason for their rise because it allowed them to focus on their primary operation. CN had to privatize to reduce the government's financial burden, since they had to cover financial losses and capital expenditures. By privatizing, CN was able to increase its competitiveness and efficiency since they were free from political interference and bureaucratic limitations. The company would go private in 1995. They really thrived once privatized and on the stock market. When they first made their IPO that same year, their market cap was a modest 2.25 billion, and by 2020, they would reach a cap of almost 110 billion. On top of that, they would be able to focus on improving their customer service and innovations. As a crown company, they had a poor reputation. The public portrayed them as a company that was slow, unreliable, and unresponsive to the needs of their clients. But once privatized, they could focus on a customer-centric approach. Tellier would also streamline CN's organization, improved its productivity and safety, and promoted aggressive expansion in the US market. This brings us to the second reason for their rise: innovation and efficiencies. Tellier would acquire the Service Reliability Strategy technology, which is the railway industry's most sophisticated shipment management software. By 1998, they would become a scheduled railway, which improved their supply chain efficiencies by scheduling trains in relation to transport demand while also factoring in favorable costs. In 2002, they would continue to increase efficiencies by introducing their IMX service, a scheduled intermodal service which would reduce their costs even more. Intermodal service is versatile because it basically offers door-to-door service for containers by reducing the labor required to move cargo freight from one mode of transportation to the next. They could effectively use one container across 3 different modes of transportation: trucks, boats, and trains, without needing to empty the contents of the container until it got to its destination. In 2023, they would add an intermodal terminal in Calgary, further increasing their efficiencies and strategic locations of their terminals to serve major areas. A few years before that, in 2021, they would also invest in innovation by partnering with Google Cloud to modernize their services by leveraging AI and data analytics. The last reason for their rise is strategic acquisitions, where they would focus their attention on the US market. In 1998, they would acquire Illinois Central Corporation for a staggering 2.4 billion American dollars, and this deal would be major, giving them access to the Gulf of Mexico. And in 2001, they would take over Wisconsin Central for 1.2 billion American dollars to expand their network across the Midwest. Next, they would acquire the rail and marine assets of the Great Lakes Transportation LLC, which would improve their NAFTA rail, linking Western Canada to Chicago, and increase their role in the transportation of commodities like iron ore, coal, and limestone for the US steel industry. They would then acquire the major portion of Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern Railway in 2009. After that, they would acquire Manitoba-based company Transax in 2018, which would strengthen their supply chain focus because they would improve their intermodal and refrigerated services. CN has a rich and important history in Canada, helping the nation expand its communities and allowing them to prosper. This roots from their strategic alignment with the Canadian government. They had to face many challenges that would lead to their fall, like competition from other railways, the decline of passenger transportation via rail, pun intended, and of course financial struggles. But they didn't stay down. They rose up and focused on their core operations after privatizing. They continue to be a leader in innovation and efficiencies in their industry, and would make strategic acquisitions that would improve their reach and supply chain. CN's story is remarkable and should inspire all entrepreneurs to be resilient and focus on what works, and like them, you should also build for the highest standards. So, with all that being said, do you have any cool stories about trains or even CN? How about railway expansion? Leave them in the comments. I'm all yours and eager to hear what stories you will share. If you would like to support this channel, leaving a like and sharing the video would really help me out with the YouTube algorithm. Bonus points if you also subscribe to the channel by hitting the notification bell. I really appreciate all the support and would love to help Canadians understand the successes and failures of Canadian companies. Thank you for watching.